happy, Jane, that you agreed to our crazy idea and willing to take part in this conversation. And I guess I just want to start by saying that you appear to be someone who has fast-tracked innovation and is making waves at your company, Otsuka. And I would love to hear more. And if you've got any special sauce that you might be willing to share with us about what actually has managed to set you apart from the norm.
Well, I'm going to start with a joke that I often tell, which is that the extroverted engineer is the one who looks at the other person's shoes when they're talking. So the reputation of data geeks and engineers everywhere is that they're pretty introverted and quiet. So I think I buck that trend a fair bit. So maybe that's one thing alone, just being someone who enjoys this space and really loves data, but is able to make eye contact without any trouble. That to me has been a really wonderful spot because I get to be sort of an advocate for and a spokesperson, or I say hype woman for the people that do this work in analytics and data. And so as I've evolved my career, I went from being a practitioner and really being involved in the nitty gritty of data to being able to advocate on behalf of folks who do that work so well. And, stepping back and looking at the whole trajectory, I probably wasn't the best at writing code. So it's probably for the best that I stepped into a role like this. But I do think that there's no secret sauce, unfortunately. I know, spoiler. But what I do think there is this notion of curiosity and trying to really think through the problem and frame it out really well when someone comes to you with something they need to figure out or to solve. The more curious you are, the more willing you are to ask the deeper why and really get to the core of what the issue is at hand, the more likely it is that you'll get the buy-in, get the kind of traction to move forward and make a change. And being willing to know that people are on a journey at all times when it comes to this kind of digital transformation or evolution. And pharma is always reticent to adopt new things. It's just a general baseline. So when you add in stuff that's moving really fast, like a lot of what's happening in the last couple of years, it just makes it that much harder. So I think that's a big part of where I've been able to hopefully help people stay grounded and hopefully able to understand the changes that are coming at them.
That term curiosity is so important to innovation, and certainly data as an input into innovation. I think a lot about what patients' role is in this type of innovation, and then the concept of citizen data has fascinated me for years. And I really think about whether it's rare disease or something that's more chronic. Patients themselves, of course, are very curious about what's going on with them and want to contribute in some ways, but it's been hard to find those sort of avenues into that citizen data and really finding meaningful ways to contribute. I'm wondering if you've thought about this too, and if you've experimented or seen any examples of a citizen data approach that would help R&D and advancements.
I can't say that I have a specific citizen data example, but I think one of the big takeaways I had from Pharmageddon that I was telling folks when I came home was how much bias I think pharma has around the intelligence and sophistication and savvy of patients. Now, in general, I don't mean to say that every patient is going to know everything about their disease state, but I think when you think about chronic and rare and maybe, partially diagnosed or not fully diagnosed, that sort of journey that patients often go on when they have some sort of a disease state that doesn't have a clear test that identifies, oh, this is high, we treat it with this, you're done, kind of thing. That patient population tends to get incredibly savvy. They may know more, certainly, than their primary care physician about what's going on and what's happened and what data there is and what clinical trials there are and all of that kind of stuff. And often even more than some of the KOLs do. I mean, they really have to become these deep experts. And I think, Paul, you had a few of those folks at the Pharmageddon conference, and that really resonated with me. The notion of how do we kind of solve for some of that curiosity that's coming from someone who's been in a real quest to solve and is much more motivated maybe even than anybody else around how to solve this problem. Certainly it's so personal for them. And so that to me is something that pharma has an opportunity to partner. And there are a number of examples I could come to from kind of my years both at Otsuka and prior places where patient advocacy partnership is a big part of what pharmaceutical companies try to strive to do. And I think there are examples also of investment in startup companies that are trying to solve some of these problems, and just the notion that maybe there is a patient who could solve it better than a physician or pharmacy or pharmaceutical company could. That to me is a really curious kind of thing to think about. And one of the things we talked about a bit at the conference was, if there wouldn't be a wave of patients trying to kind of form their own solutions and companies that may not be too far away as data becomes easier
Yeah,
to access.
absolutely. And I'm thinking about an example. This is from years ago, but it has really informed our work at RxPX. And it was a group of patients in a rare disease condition that were I don't want to say experimenting, but they were testing out different sort of titrations and sharing. It was a group of about a couple hundred patients, so a sizable amount, and they were taking the data, and I believe it was as simple as an Excel sheet, but they were looking at what the results were when they were changing the dosage pattern a little bit, and then eventually got enough data to take it back to the manufacturer and say, hey, we think there might be something there, and formed a wonderful partnership around it. So that was an example from years ago, but it really just inspired us in thinking of, when the patient can own their data and be in partnership with pharma, how that can really help advance. One of your nicknames, Jane, is Innovation Engine, which I love. And, I see, and we work with every day, so many engines and entrepreneurs, or intrapreneurs, if you will. And so the example that you were just giving within your own organization is talking amongst teams about the different needs and the different data. But being an entrepreneur can be really challenging, and especially in this industry. So, I imagine you think of yourself as an entrepreneur just hearing you talk. And I wonder, I'm often asked, like, what advice, do you have when you're trying to innovate from inside?
The more that cup is full of sort of optimism, the better off you're going to be, because there are going to be people who are very either defensive or resistant in some way, or even just passively not understanding the point of what it is you think needs to change, or see it as just more work, and they're already busy. And so that's really hard, for people who are genuinely in a place where they don't have any capacity to do anything new or different, and they would just see this as a problem for them. So helping kind of understand and diagnose those various reactions to something you might propose is really important. But coming at it with that sort of passionate excitement, optimism can sometimes, to a certain degree, overwhelm a bit of that negative energy, to kind of be like, oh, well, you seem to really care about this. And I think we've done that really successfully on the commercial side when it came to getting our sales folks to use these sort of next best action engagement tools. Initially, we tried kind of looking for the biggest place to go, or the brand with maybe the most upside from the technology, which would be intuitively where you might start. But those were brands that were feeling really good about their current process and just didn't see it. They weren't seeing the value. And then you have a brand that's doing okay, but could probably be doing better. And they were like, well, at this point, we can't make it worse. So, hey, let's partner, let's try, And so sometimes when you start there and you get that traction and you start to see the turnaround, then it's a lot easier to go to the next group of folks, and they're like, well, I see it, I get it now, I'm more open. So you have to find kind of your least resistance path entrepreneurially. Whereas I think when you're talking about a net new, something you're going to start, you really do want to find a place where you have like the most market or the most people who would benefit from your idea. It's a little counterintuitive. Sometimes that's too big to take on at once. You may be better off with a slightly smaller win to kind of get going. And then I always come back to the idea of being curious as opposed to being kind of like judgmental about what people are doing. And the more curiosity you come at people, and the more you understand what their resistance is about.
We've seen already in very small and isolated cases, patients have actually been so far as been able to develop their own medications and push for pathways for others as well. But what is the natural sort of endpoint for all of this?
I think for me, the notion of a true partnership between the pharmaceutical industry and patients is something I've always sought after, because I do feel like we have such a common goal of trying to bring innovative solutions that can solve health problems. It's not that other characters in the play are not a part of that. That's the drive. And certainly for me personally, I've been super lucky to meet patients and get to hear their stories and find the kind of inspiration that comes from knowing that maybe not directly, but very indirectly, you've been part of making them healthier and able to do what they wanted to do with their life. So to me, that's like so much bigger than almost anything else you could be tackling on a day-to-day basis. And that's why hopefully pharma and patients can get a lot closer together over time.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with so much of what you're saying. And I've always seen it as a sort of a partnership for life. And there's a really interesting triad. And I mean, this is what we spend our days on is, helping doctors more easily onboard patients onto specialty therapies, helping those patients have the support that they need, and a hybrid, human and AI and technology approach. But I really see it is a partnership for life, because those three pieces, right? The doctor, the HCP, the patient, and pharma are, there's no other triad, right? There's no other point that you can add in there that's more important. And, we really see our jobs, and I know, my fellow CEOs do as well, is like, we need to be the engine behind that, and need to be in the background, but strengthening and facilitating those relationships, because it's a very precious one. And for, for as much fire that as pharma comes under, when you deliver a life-saving, a life-changing therapy, and if you've been on the receiving end, as many of us have, I mean, there's just nothing more important.
So on to the next strange question. We're currently recording this interview at the end of October, and any American citizen will realize right now that there is a major election looming. So my question to both of you guys, don't worry, I'm not going to get you to shout about your favorite candidate. What I would love you to do is to just say, if there's something in this area that you would like to change if you were president for the day. If you were president for the day, what change would you like to see in this field of working with patients and data for the better?
Isn't it for a day? I think it might take more than a day.
We'll give you a couple of years then. Go on. We're generous here.
Okay. All right. With a couple of years, I think when you think about onboarding onto something, so think about something that you've signed up for lately. It could be, it could be something online. It could be a sport. It could be a life change. But when we onboard into new things, generally there's an introduction. You might have, you join a new board, and you've got, a board workshop and a whole binder full of information and an expectation. When you onboard as a patient into a diagnosis, there really isn't anything. We don't have like a type of social health prescription or social onboarding, or, hey, here's some other people that have gone through this, and here's some information you can trust, and here's some tools to help you. And, similarly for doctors, right? And especially if they're, working in rare disease, this might be the first case that they've had, what's there for them. So I would think about, how do we onboard people into these clubs that they haven't necessarily or chosen or wanted, but at the end of the day, this is their new reality. So how do we onboard them, and how can we use both humans and technology to support that? And the crazy thing is, I mean, decades of research shows that this has an impact. It's very cost effective, so it's not about money. It's very time efficient, so it's not about time. It's proven to have improvements not only on psychosocial, but on adherence and self-management, navigation, all those good things. So why don't we just simply do that, right? Why don't we simply help, patients and their families and doctors on board into the diagnosis that they're faced with?
Yeah, I love
Lynda
it.
for president. That's all I
No,
can
and I
say.
think you're right. I think it happens, but it's not as like orchestrated as you'd like it to be. I think, there are plenty of online and in person sort of forums that are naturally forming from patients, and especially if it's a slightly larger population of a rare disease. I spent a fair amount of time with the Crohn's and colitis population, which is like a multi-million person group. And they do have, their communities that they formed, and they do seem to have a really great way of kind of helping people get comfortable with the new realities of their disease state, as uncomfortable as they might be. And so I think that's absolutely needed.
So a lot of what we've talked about today is there's almost like a sort of breaking of the social contract between patients and their data. And we've talked about the bad implications of that and how we as an industry, we as a sector can do better. I want to just sort of turn it around and just say, if it was more obvious that the more the patient opens and the more the patient is willing to volunteer their data, is there kind of a positive side of that social contract? If I, as a patient, was to feel that I was giving away more of my data, would I also be receiving more in return right now?
I'm inclined to say yes, but I would caveat to say that it matters how people are using this data, and so that's always the main, like, that's the risk, right? If everyone was using this data for positive and altruistic reasons, then absolutely. And I think there are examples where when patients have been able to register their genetics or put things into some sort of a more large database of information, then patterns can be determined later. So maybe when they were kind of first having symptoms and their genetic profile was uploaded, we didn't have a name for whatever it was that was wrong, but now we do. And by the way, we have a treatment. So like, let's go back and find those folks and connect the dots for them. But I also think there's an element of risk that you see with this sort of data, and that is, makes you
Yeah,
pause
it's
when
like
it
there's
comes to
more of a
sharing,
disincentive
say,
than
your
incentive
genetics or
right now. It's not really work.
yeah, unfortunately, I think that's true. Yeah, and some of that has to do with the privacy policies not being either clear enough that you know really what you're signing up for, or they're pretty clear but they're too loose, right? There's too many opportunities for things to be used in a way that wasn't the original intention. So that trust of data is, and it makes me a little bit, personally skeptical of giving away tons of information because then you're the product, right? And you didn't
Yeah.
necessarily sign up to be the product. You were hoping to learn something. And so I think that's the challenge we have right now with some of the structure. But I will say, if you look at some of the examples on the far extreme where data is very private, right? There's a concern, like in Europe, where people want to know about other people that might have their rare disease, and they can't connect. And so it's actually where you can see that there is a place where it's too far. And then patients are sort of saying, why can't we find each other? This is too much constraint on our ability to seek for care and to understand different patterns or different, subtypes of something or whatever because of all of the privacy around the data. So there's probably a spot that we haven't quite narrowed in on. I think fully open might be too risky for folks to have that information used in a sort of an unintended consequence. But if you don't have any sharing of data, then you can't figure out those patterns and really solve for kind of the large numbers types of issues you might want to run a model on or something like that.
The privacy by design, I mean, those are such great principles, and really looking at, the patient, the user owning their data, having, clear and easy, plain language, information on how their data is going to be used, having choice and control over that. These are really they're very simple, but if we're following the privacy by design sort of code, then I think we're in good shape. If we really dig into how that's been designed, is to help give people the visibility and the transparency around choosing how their data can be used. And I think we should continue on that path. There's great work that's being done there, but at the end of the day, giving people, to your point, Paul, not just the control, but also the ROI, if you will, right? The what's in it for you and what's your contribution overall, and being clear about that is important.
Yeah, it feels like it's still a kind of a one-way street. And yes, while you say that, Linda, good work is being done, there is still skepticism, and our self-confessed data geek right here is still somewhat skeptical as to where her data might go. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think if you knew for sure that it would come back to you in some way, but I think for the most part, you don't really know if it's ever going to get added up into something of value. And maybe not for you personally. I don't know if that's necessarily what I'm thinking of, but more like somehow you're paying it forward in some way that what you're doing is going to help somebody else someday. And I think that's a big initial reason for a lot of people to join a clinical trial in the first place, right? Because they're in a place where they need help. There isn't a lot of other options, so they're willing to try something new and different. And if it works, awesome. If it doesn't work, we'll learn something and then maybe we'll find another option. That is sometimes a harder sell nowadays for people because they're not totally sure that's really what they're doing. And so I think it's definitely evolved a bit, and that skepticism is very real for a lot of folks. And when you think about having a sort of undiagnosed problem where you have symptoms but you have no clarity on what's wrong, it is probably really hard to feel like you're getting something out of what you're doing because it may just be another bit of time where you spend feeling crummy without a solution. And so there's definitely I definitely think there's going to be challenges with that, and in some ways the advocacy and patient awareness can almost compound it because you're kind of like, I know that this can be a thing that can go sideways, so I'm more skeptical than ever about what we're about to do. And so we'll have to make sure we kind of measure that as we think through how to engage more effectively with patients and with clinicians to engage with patients, right? Because I think that's part of it too. Is clinicians are often the ones who are starting these conversations around gathering data. So how do they position it appropriately with patients?
Yeah. And I think, thinking into the future too, and a very near future on AI is, we have to be very mindful about the data that's going into the large language models and the diversity or lack of diversity and the privilege or lack of privilege. We're using AI right now for some fairly privileged problems. And so we have to be super mindful as technologists and innovators that we are bringing that diversity and bringing that equity to the language models that we're using, or else we're going to sort of perpetuate, right, this data that's not as reflective, not as useful, not as diverse to really serve all of us.
Yeah, AI can really be an unfortunate mirror of some of the things that we do and the biases that we have. Yeah, because it's trained on us, and so our messiness is in there. So as much as you might want to think that it's going to be more objective, it may be absolutely just as biased as the humans that put that information out there in the first place. And we saw that, I think, in the early days of the LLM, hallucination stuff, where it was very clear that it's just going to kind of parrot back whatever it kind of thinks is the right answer for you. So the more we can navigate some of that more effectively, I think we're getting there, right? We're mitigating a lot of those things now, but it got out ahead in some ways of the real story of what this technology could do for us. And so it's going to be a bit of a challenge to figure out how to bring as much sort of consciousness of bias into the solutions we create. I don't think we'll ever get rid of bias, but I think if we're more aware of what the biases might be and then think through that implication, that should help a great deal. But it's not going to go away. It's going to be part of everything we're doing. So it's a really good call. And unfortunately, as more technology becomes almost like kind of the idea that the internet should just be a basic human right sort of concept, right? That idea is going to create more disparities and more kind of distance between
It's
people
trained
who have
on human
access to all
data.
those resources
Yeah,
and people who do
absolutely.
not. So it's only going to make it worse in a way. But I think it's something we shouldn't try to solve it. It's just harder maybe with that added
Yeah.
to it.
Well, Jane, thank you so much for being willing to be so generous with your ideas, energy, insights, and just general positivity. As you said, just bringing a smile is often the way to make things actually happen. So I'm sure
Yes.
Lynda wants to say thank you as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dane. Pleasure to reconnect and talk through some pretty meaty issues here, from from leadership to data to the future, but
In
certainly
your
that
presidential campaign, evidently too.
exactly. Yeah, but just I love your optimistic curiosity is what is desperately needed. So thank you so much for sharing
And
that.
your partnership has been wonderful to get to know you, and I feel like this work that you're doing in your space is so important to patient care and to getting to better outcomes. So kudos to you as well, what you're doing.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah.